First off, let me just say I'm a tad biased towards one particular side-scrolling beat-em-up. But I have covered that to death on my channel. In fact, it's my most popular video, and let's face it, other games like Golden Axe and Alien Storm have also just had as much love from me. Now as a kid, it wasn't Streets of Rage that grabbed my attention originally. In fact, there was another game that I was very much into before I even got my Mega Drive, and that game was Renegade. But not for long, because shortly after, when the new kids on the block turned up with this newfangled machine, there was one game that we played over and over and over and over and over again. You know what's great about retro gaming now that I'm a grown up? The ability to check out the games that you grew up with. To then discover that you just scratched the tip of the iceberg with that particular memory. Double Dragon for the Master System is far from the only game in the series, and even further from being the best. Spoiler alert, I had a kick-ass time making this video. So join me as I venture down the dragon hole with Billy and Jimmy Lee to save that girl that's always getting punched in the gut as we look into the complete history of Double Dragon. Welcome to Slope's Game Room. Welcome to the arcades of the 80s, a place that just feels a little more lonely without this game, Shohei Neketsu Kuho Kunio-kun. Well, this game was actually made by Yoshihisa Kishimoto, who had been with the company Technos for literally 4 months up to this point. And well, you know the score, we're in fact getting a little ahead of ourselves. So let's go back to the beginning. He started life working as a designer at Data East in the early 80s, straight from school in the Laserdisc department. Games such as Dragon Lair were all the rage in the arcades, and young Kishimoto worked on both Cobra Command, also known as Thunderstorm, and Road Blaster, also known as Road Avenger. In other words, if you had one of these, then there is a 99.9% chance that you owned one of his games. That's where Technos came in. It was time for Yoshihisa to move on, as he was headhunted by the company to work on these flashy FMV type games, but for them. So he went to the interview and sort of just said no. Instead of taking them up on their offer, he had something else in mind, a game based on himself. You see, back in his early school days, Mr. Kishimoto remembers getting into fights every single day, mainly due to a rough breakup. He even goes on record to say that there were family reasons as well, but there was a girl and she dumped me, which pulled the trigger. He pitched this idea of himself in the interview and spiced it up a bit by mixing in a bit of love of his favourite film of the time, Bruce Lee's Enter the Dragon. Now, for anyone out there that has not seen this movie, I demand that you pause this video right now and go and watch it if you haven't. Anyway, slightly longer story short, they accepted his idea of an Enter the Dragon / retrospective look at his thuggish youth game, and the single player experience Shohei Neketsu Kuho Kunio-kun was released, and if it looks familiar, which it should, well, that's probably because when it was translated for European and American audiences, it was named Renegade. Slightly changed, and looks more like the 1979 movie Warriors rather than Enter the Dragon. And it became probably my first truly loved 2D beat-em-up. Now, without going into the series too much, as it may possibly end up as its own complete history video in the future, and could possibly be even longer than this video. The Kunio-kun games, or Renegade, whatever you want to call them, were massive. Well, they were massive in Japan, and sadly they received sort of okay to sort of good reviews everywhere else. In fact, Renegade, playing back now, sadly isn't the great game that my younger self thought it was, but the original game in Japan resulted in a crazy amount of sequels and spin-offs. However, for this story, we'll just be mentioning this version, the arcade original. Released in 1986, the game was so popular that it wasn't long before the request for a sequel was put forward. What could he improve? The first obvious idea was the game to become a two-player game, because, you know, two players, twice the earning for arcade owners. But there was one more condition put in place by Technos, and that was to make the game more appealing to a Western audience. And with his love of Bruce Lee's Enter the Dragon, which you've all seen now, right? Yeah, good. Well, from his love of that international hit of a movie still fresh in his mind, Double Dragon was born. Here it is, the sort of but not really sequel to this, Double Dragon, a tried and tested formula with better graphics, gameplay and mechanics made to appeal to a worldwide audience, resulting in pure 80s nostalgia, something that his first game was not able to pull off, no matter how street thuggy the characters looked on the box art. The game appeared in the right place and at the right time, with just enough elements of new involved to make it its own thing. For instance, rather than starting and playing the game, there was a whole story. Well, as much of a story as this. Bad guy punches girl in the stomach, kidnaps her, and you guys, Hammer and Spike, are the two brothers that are here to save the day. You got your three main buttons, punch, kick and jump, which can be bind to help you traverse all the levels to save her. One of the fondest memories I have of the game is screaming at the second player to stop getting in my way as I accidentally kick him in the face or vice versa. Something that, although frustrating at the time, planted the seed of one of the most fondest gaming memories of all time. However, nothing is more nostalgia-juicing for me than the last level. You fight the final boss and all of a sudden nothing. What are you supposed to do? Well, you quickly find out that Menage a Trois is off the table, probably because you're brothers, and instead a fight to the death until you are literally the last man standing to get yourself a kiss and a bit of arse from the damsel in distress. The end. So it's pretty safe to say I've gone back and played the game and it was great. I suppose we should probably look at the other ports. And other than the Master System version, the game also came out on the Atari ST, Amiga, IBM PC, Amstrad TPC, ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64, MSX, Atari 2600, Atari 7800, the Genesis, Lynx on your mobile, Xbox 360, Windows, iOS, Android, and how can we forget the greatest console and most underrated console of all time, the Ouya. Only joking, it's crap. I'm not going to cover every single version as we'll be here all day. If you want an in-depth look, I suggest going to check out the Let's Compare series from Gaming History Source. Not just for Double Dragon 1, but all of them. But until then, let me just point out a few worth mentioning. The version I played on the Master System is actually quite a damn fine port of that original arcade game. And you'll be surprised to hear that the classic NES port, which is what most people likely remember, actually changes from the arcade quite a bit. It's got far more platforming and is far closer to the original Kunio-kun games. And although the Master System game featured the classic two-player co-op option, on the NES they've sadly gone for the take turns option, similar to games like Super Mario Bros. But hey, you do get a one-on-one fighting game, which is actually quite a nice touch. The levels start off the same as the arcade version, but however, change drastically most of the time, and strangely enough, the game has sort of RPG elements added. Basically, you start with a punch, a kick and a headbutt, perform these moves, and you get experience which then changes to hearts. This gives you the ability to do roundhouse kicks and uppercuts. A very strange turnaround for the series in my opinion. But, looking back, I actually really like it. It's a nice varied version of the game. You also have the immensely popular Game Boy version. This one is sort of a mix between the changed up version on the NES and that original arcade game. The levels feel a lot more NES with a few slight variations on the design, but the RPG elements are now missing. There is definite fun to have with this version, and in my opinion it stands on its own 2 feet compared to the obviously far superior Master System and NES version. But for now, let's end on this, the Atari 2600 version. Yeah, go on, laugh away. Even though they all look like they've got boners, this is actually a damn impressive game for the system. And with that, I think we've covered the first game enough. So, moving on.
Double Dragon 2, The Revenge for your Nintendo Entertainment System. The best action game ever from Acclaim.
So it's established. You are a force to be reckoned with. You save the girl, nobody punches your girl in the gut and gets away with it, right? Well, what about being shot several times instead? Oh yes, they've gone and done it this time, hence the name. DD2 not only has absolutely kick-ass cover art, but also, in my opinion, is an all-round better game. Sure, you still get your typical go right and beat up bad guys over 4 stages, but it just feels a tad more refined this time. Although a lot of people think that the game is possibly too similar to the original. And if that's the case, you'll not be surprised to hear that the game was planned to literally just be an upgrade of the original, before it became its own arcade board entirely. The graphics are slightly improved, I adore the classic music, and although the controls, which have weirdly changed to assigned buttons for hitting bad guys in front and behind you, take a little getting used to, in all honesty, it doesn't affect the game badly at all. It's just, well, it's different. Just like the last time after beating up the Batman Forever looking bad guys, you go up against the cyborg looking boss who was seen shooting your lady friend at the beginning. Kill him, and well, for anyone that has played the game before, you'll notice that it has a far more futuristic robot feel about it. And this continues as the light gets darker, eerie sounds ooze out of the arcade cabinet, a shadow creeps from your character's sprite, and you end up going against a spooky purple version of yourself. Defeats, yourself, and the end. Gotta love that mullet. Obviously, endless amounts of ports were made for the game, from the crappy ZX Spectrum 48K version of the game to the Japan exclusive Mega Drive version by Powsoft. This version is just okay. They tried to emulate the arcade as best they could, but obviously with the Mega Drive not being as powerful as the arcade, it sadly results in quite a lot of slowdown, and obviously reduced graphics. It's still great fun to play, don't get me wrong, it's just not as good as the game it's copying. Plus, considering this game is a crazy rarity now, just begs the question, why would you bother? The NES port, however, is a tad better, and this time has that 2-player co-op option. But what makes this game stand out, and weirdly something I didn't pick up on as a kid, is the jump between different styles of side-scrolling. You obviously have the standard side-scrolling like this, where you can go up and down on the playing field, but you also have this sort of Zelda 2 gameplay style here, which forces you to get up close and personal to the enemy. It all makes the game bloody hard, and similar to games like, I suppose, Shinobi in the platforming department, which sadly do not work too well in this instance. A lot of the time, it's just more frustrating than anything else. And again, without going into every single port, I'll end on the PC Engine version. If that doesn't get you going, well, why are you watching this video? Double Dragon just isn't for you. Animated cutscenes give you an in-depth look at the story. The actual gameplay has also had a bit of an upgrade over the arcade version, as this game actually has 9 missions in the game, making it feel like a far more complete experience. The arcade game is good, but in my opinion, the ultimate version of the game is this one.
Dragon 3, the ultimate in NES martial arts action continues with all new weapons, characters, and street fighting moves against the world's most awesome villains. Double Dragon 3 from Acclaim. The action keeps coming. Obviously, Double Dragon 3, the Rosetta Stone, came out a couple of years later.
And well, looking at the original flyer alone, it will hopefully give you an idea in just how much they changed the theme of the game for this one.
Mission 1, America.
It may look like it has better graphics, but honestly, I much prefer the two earlier games, as this one is choppy as hell. You got a few new moves at your disposal, like the knee drop, a flying headbutt, and this sort of backflip move. However, everything else is missing. Obviously, you've got the standard punch, kick and jump, but gone is your roundhouse kick, gone is the backward spin kick, and gone is your beloved backward elbow. Well, sort of gone anyway. You can buy the spin kick along with a few other moves at the beginning of the level if you want. How weird is that? And by the way, the same goes for the weapons. You used to pick them up throughout the game, well, now you buy them. I think it's best to not look at the fact that this is a Double Dragon game, and instead let's try and look at it as its own game. Because let's face it, it's obvious, the previous two games are far better. The dreaded third game syndrome. Overall, it is quite a weird game about collecting these Rosetta Stones, and then you got to go to Egypt to fight the ultimate bad guy. There is fun to have if you look for it, but honestly, just pick up one of the earlier ones. However, if you really do need some Double Dragon free action, then you probably want to play this version. Why? Well, for the first time in the series, the game was actually released in North America first, and the Japanese version was made afterwards. This ended up resulting in a few things being changed, most notably the fact that the in-game shop is now gone, and you have full access to all of the characters and moves throughout the game. Sadly, it's still not as good as its older brother and sister, but at least now it's a far more enjoyable experience. As you would expect, and I really hope you don't remember, several ports of that average arcade game came out. And, well, honestly, they mostly play like crap, with probably the best port being on the Mega Drive. But honestly, even that is the best of a bad bunch. A dark time for the Double Dragon franchise. That is, other than this port for the NES. Why? Well, that's because Technos never made the arcade game or any of the other ports, except for this one. And thankfully, the result is far better. Double Dragon 3, the Sacred Stones, as it was known to Europe and American audiences, is by far the best version of the game. Now hold up. Please understand that this is just my opinion. I understand I'm majorly in the minority for creating a video about Double Dragon 3 and literally just not crapping all over it. This is a widely hated online by other YouTubers game, but I would be lying if I didn't tell you I actually had quite a lot of fun playing this one. Firstly, the classic Double Dragon theme, or at least a remix of the theme, welcomes you as you load up the game, giving you the impression of this being a true sequel to the classics before it. You got 2 or 3 extra characters playable from the arcade in this version, and whilst on this screen, how could I not mention this? The hilarious, the infamous misspelling of Billy. Good quality control there, guys. Your moves are back, the controls feel almost the same, and no longer do you need to go to the shops to buy them. If you enjoyed Double Dragon 1 or Double Dragon 2 for the NES, then you're probably going to be surprised to find out that this game is actually not that bad considering the unwarranted hate it gets online. With that said, it's far from the best, but it's even further from the worst. So with their heads in their hands, Double Dragon 3 in the arcades almost killed the franchise. Well, not really, but it did leave a sour taste in the mouth to all that had been looking forward to it. But only 1 year later, in 1992, Technos returned for the SNES exclusive, and might I add, a must-own, Super Double Dragon, also known as the Return of Double Dragon in Japan. Now this is a bit of a strange entry if you ask me. It's far slower than the original trilogy, but allows for a far more technical feeling fighting game that perhaps games like Streets of Rage, Turtles, Golden Axe or Final Fight would allow for. Personally, I do prefer all of those games, but that doesn't make this one bad. You got this power gauge that once you fill up can be used to perform special moves which takes out your enemies depending on how high it is. A few extra moves have been added. The storyline is classic Double Dragon. It has 7 stages, making it feel like a more complete game. And although the controls are not perfect Double Dragon feel, it's really nice to see a game for the series that isn't a port of something else. And as a result, you end up having something quite unique for the series. However, what wasn't good for the series was the Game Gear game Double Dragon: The Revenge of Billy Lee. Again, this one was not made by Technos, but instead it was made by Virgin. Now, Virgin are a reputable company, especially on Sega consoles, and if you're going to take anything away, you can't deny that this game looks bloody awesome for the system. Stunning, in fact. But it feels, and to be fair, it plays nothing like those original games. Sure, it's a typical side-scrolling beat-em-up per se, but come on, in this game, you actually get a gun. How weird is that? Anyway, firearms aside, it just plays quite badly. Well, don't bother with this one. Now, whilst all this was going on, one very popular crossover game was also released and sort of came out of nowhere for the SNES, Genesis, NES and the Game Boy. Battletoads Double Dragon. This game is actually not a Double Dragon game, it's more of a sequel to Battletoads. Because this one was made by the brilliant Rare with no involvement from Technos, the game is sadly just an okay game in my opinion. It's far from the best Double Dragon game, that's for sure. It's not a bad game, with the NES probably being my personal favourite as it pushes the system limits. But gameplay wise, the game is just really hard. Probably too hard to find overly enjoyable in my opinion. So moving on and back to their roots, we finally get Double Dragon 5. Now before looking at this one, let me just explain a few things.
To be a dragon, you gotta be strong.
Double Dragon, by this point, was seriously all the rage. You got action figures, you got a Saturday morning TV show, you got comics, LCD games, and you've even got a movie. All of these are actually pretty crap, but because they kept making them along with the games, people kept buying them. And it's because of this, games like Double Dragon were literally squeezed out of the arse of any game developer that would take the bait. Yep, sadly the guys that made those original games over at Technos sadly had nothing to do with this 16-bit game. Double Dragon 5 by Leland Interactive Media is utter pants. It sucks. Instead of following on from the games, which to be fair were all over the place story-wise beforehand, DD5 is sadly based on the mediocre cartoon show, and as you can see, it's not even a side-scrolling beat-em-up. Now I know this has been done fairly successfully in the past with other games in the genre like Golden Axe Duel, but in this case, it just feels really bad. Overall, I just wouldn't bother with this crap copy of a... well, I'll let you work that out. Now I don't go looking for games like this, as they don't really entertain me. But if you ask me, it's one of the worst one-on-one fighting games I've personally played. So, what's next? Another one-on-one fighting game, that's what. The 90s bloody love these games. And this one is very much a typical Neo Geo style game for obviously the Neo Geo, and also the original PlayStation. Now even with my vague knowledge of one-on-one fighting games, I know what I like, and I like this. It feels far more complete. Maybe that's because it was made by Technos and published by SNK in 1995. When you boot up the game, it weirdly actually shows a clip from the movie and even features some of the classic character designs based on the movie rather than in the game. The music is great and the gameplay is, well, exactly what you would expect. It plays fine, and really, if you ask me, it's a great diversion for the franchise. Slope's Game Room likes this one. Yet another Double Dragon fighting game also exists, the brilliant Rage of the Dragons, again for the Neo Geo, which basically is a better version of the previously mentioned game. Although I will say that although it may look like an official sequel to Double Dragon, the developer was unable to get the rights to the franchise in time, and therefore the two brothers are instead now called Billy and Jimmy Lewis. Now, other than the albeit pretty Game Boy Advance remake with not so good gameplay due to the overly zoomed in screen, the iOS remake that if played with a controller actually ends up being quite a good game. But this itself is also a remake. It's a remake for Double Dragon on the Zeebo. Yep, the Zeebo. A console that was only really marketed in places like Mexico, China, India and Brazil. But don't worry if you feel like you're missing out, just go get that iOS version. It's actually quite a good version of the game. Probably not worth going out of your way for, but all in all, it's surprisingly good. But that's enough of remakes and ports of that original game. What we really want is a proper new Double Dragon game. The series has had some incredible highs and some mega lows so far, as well as some crappy, let's face it, marketing in other mediums. The franchise really needed a good facelift, and thankfully it got it. If you ask me, it's all because of one particular game company.
I dislike law enforcement with a vengeance.
Pro tip: if your franchise is going down the drain, let these guys have a look at fixing it. You are almost guaranteed a brilliant game, which will be demonstrated perfectly with what could possibly be my favourite game in the series. Double Dragon Neon. And that is all you needed. Classic Double Dragon story in a new setting, made for new audiences, and best of all, done really well. Double Dragon Neon is the one game that if you have never played any in this series and only have time for one, then go for either this one or this one. Now that again might be a slightly unpopular opinion, because this game brings back the shop and basically requires you to grind away over and over and over to buy new moves and upgrades. The reason I like it though so much is because I get to play the game on loop, and thankfully it's a really good game. But it's a far more technical game too. Buying all these extra moves and new ways of playing becomes a requirement towards the end of the game. Your latest method might not work, but hey, it's all good because you get to grind your way through earlier levels to try a different way of playing. On top of this, the new art style, the over-the-top 80s humour molds together to give you something truly special. In my opinion, an absolute high point for the series, which was sadly followed by the 2013 Xbox 360 exclusive Double Dragon 2 Wonder of the Dragons. Oh boy, would you look at this. Pro Jared said it best, the worst thing to happen to Double Dragon. And you know what? I agree. You could possibly forgive the graphics of this Xbox Live Arcade game, but the controls are abysmal. Not just the fighting, but also simply just moving around the screen. It's quite hard to explain, but doing something as simple as turning around now requires you to sort of do this double flick. You see, the first one just makes you move backwards slightly, something you don't want happening when you're sandwiched between two bad guys. This is just an awful game, and it's often cited as the worst side-scrolling beat-em-up ever made. Weirdly, it does remind me of the Bouncer for the PlayStation 2, and on a side note, if you do want a good side-scrolling beat-em-up, go check that game out. However, for this, it is the last and sadly the worst Double Dragon game so far. Wow, talk about a bumpy ride. Double Dragon is without a doubt a fondly remembered franchise that, although may have had a few down points in its life, mostly due to the crazy amount of god-awful ports of the original few games, has pretty much always come out on top. And with a fair few cameos from Billy and Jimmy Lee in other games such as Super Spike V-Ball on the NES and WWF Superstars in the arcades, it's obvious that the franchise has most importantly left an overwhelmingly lasting impression on the video game industry as a whole. So, with that, I think it's about time I invite an old friend over, sit on the sofa, grab some beers, and we get seriously old school up in here with some of the best and most classic two-player co-op side-scrolling beat-em-ups out there. Double Dragon. Hey guys, thanks for checking out my video. If you want to check out some more of my videos, click the links that you see at the top of the screen. If you haven't already, please rate, favourite, comment and subscribe. And if you want to support the show that little bit extra, come and check me out over on Patreon. This is DJ Slope signing out, and hopefully I'll see you all next time.